Today, I'm going to review a book, but I'm not going to review a book in the traditional way. I'm not going to tell you whether it was a good book or not. I'm not going to tell you what the plot was about. I'm not going to really discuss any of that kind of stuff. Instead, I'm going to give you a breakdown as an author reading the book. And we're going to talk about things like the prose and how Emily Henry conveys emotion to her readers in her book, Book Lovers. Overall, the book was delightful. But I was struck by something as I read it. It was interesting, and I apologize for this tangent, but the lens through which you read really does inform your experience of a book. I didn't sit down to read it as sort of an escape. Instead, I was very intentional in the way I approached this book, and the result was that there were actually points when I found myself laughing out loud, not at the comedy in the book, but because of the delight I felt when I discovered what it was that Emily Henry was doing from a prose perspective. For anybody who's new to this channel, my name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author. I've written 25 books, published most of them, and I make these videos because there are a lot of authors out there who aren't making it, and I don't want you to be one of them. In that vein, we are going to be breaking down books. I like to read books that are outside of my genre or adjacent to my genre to understand what it is that the author is doing or not doing that is conveying emotion to their reader. Emily Henry's Book Lovers is a rom-com. It's supposed to be lighthearted. It's supposed to move you through the story fairly quickly with a lot of emotional tugs on your heartstrings. And she does a great job at that. There were definitely points when I could feel the emotion that she was trying to convey, even though I was taking a more critical analysis of the book. Now, my goal here is not to tell you whether this book is good or not, whether it's for you or not. I will say that if you're thinking about picking it up, it is definitely an adult book. Like most modern rom-coms, there's some sexual content, but it can be skipped very easily, which I did because it's not my jam. I came away with 2 or 3 sort of realizations about the genre that she's writing in, and some ideas about how I could apply those things to my writing. So one of the things that she really focuses on is dichotomy. Almost every time that something is presented in the story, within a few pages, you see something else that is the mirror opposite. So a great example of this, the main character is a fairly high-strung, uptight career woman. And her sister, who plays a major role in the story, is the opposite. She's a stay-at-home mom, she's not very organized, she's sort of free-spirited, and they play off of each other throughout the whole book. Similarly, the main love interest is contrasted with a cousin of his. Both are good-looking, both are accomplished, but they're just very different in their personalities. They're mirror opposites of each other. And that plays out throughout the entire story. Anytime we're introduced to a couple, we see how different they are, which is fascinating because our 2 leads are almost the same. And so throughout the entire story, it's a constant battle of this versus that, 2 sides of the same coin, until we meet our main characters. They're the same. And so it sort of highlights their relationship as special because everybody else in the book is opposed. And even if readers don't pick up on that consciously, they're going to pick up on that subconsciously. And so as soon as they see the main character and the main love interest, their subconscious is working, saying, ooh, these 2 things belong together. And this is just a fascinating technique, right? And you could probably do it the opposite way too. Everything is paired and then have something that is diametrically opposed to highlight it, right? But because we have everything in the story opposed, as soon as we see, as a reader, the thing that is the same, we subconsciously think to ourselves, okay, these people really belong together, which serves the purposes perfectly because this is a love story. And so we want fated lovers. The next thing that I noticed particularly was the pacing. The story isn't full of action. It's not full of conflict either. The conflicts are mostly internal, as the main character feels out of sync with herself. She has a lot of strength, but she also has some critical weaknesses. And this is fairly typical for any story, right? We want our main character to have strength, something that people can cheer them on about, but also we want them to have these weaknesses. And so most of the conflict in the story happens because of internal turmoil. Now, again, this is very common for the genre, but what I thought was particularly interesting was how much reminiscence played a role in that conflict. There wasn't a huge amount of external conflict, but there was enough internal conflict that felt real, that it kept the story moving at a pretty good pace. The book is about 80,000 words long, and I honestly wondered how she was going to sort of keep the pace of it going without having sort of that external conflict of he said, she said, or somebody's lying to somebody else. And some of that stuff does happen, but the majority of our conflict is inside the main character, which also provided an interesting flow to the story because you have periods of reminiscence punctuated by periods of action. And this sort of flip-flop between the two kept things always fresh enough that you didn't get bored. And so I thought that was a really good thing to highlight as an author, that I don't necessarily have to just be nonstop action. I can have reminiscence, as long as the reminiscence tells its own story and builds throughout the book, because more and more is revealed as we go. Now, I will also say that Emily Henry is a particularly crafty writer. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of pieces of the story that reflect exactly what she is doing. And so it's sort of like revealing your secret sauce without actually revealing your secret sauce. So for example, there's a point in the story where the male lead says, hey, in this manuscript that we're working on together, we shouldn't reveal the main character's desire right away. And they think about it for a moment and they say, yeah, you're right. The tension of that is going to be good. Well, if you've been paying attention in the story, you realize at that point that that's exactly what Emily Henry has been doing with this story. The desires of the female lead are not actually revealed until about halfway through the book. What you think are her core desires are actually not. And that reveal becomes all the more powerful because of it. And so you can see that she is sort of explaining the trick as she's doing the trick. And this is fascinating because there's a misconception that surprise or secrecy is attractive to people. And while it can be true, for the majority of people, knowing the way the trick is done does not actually reduce the enjoyment of the trick. We think it will, but most often it doesn't. And so by sort of revealing her tricks as she goes, Emily Henry does a great job of pulling the reader one layer deeper into the story. The last thing I'm going to highlight, and believe me, there is a lot more. I have like pages of notes on this book. There's a lot more that I could talk about, but the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video is our author does something very interesting with the descriptions. And what's fascinating about this is I've never actually encountered this. And it might actually be a convention in the genre she's writing. I don't know. I don't read modern rom-coms. But I thought it was particularly clever. And that's that she redescribes the people that the main character encounters over and over and over again. But every single time, the description is a layer deeper, a new facet of their personality, something that gives a fuller picture of the individual. And this sort of active observation is really, really effective at making you feel like you know these characters, at giving depth to them. For example, the main character's sister, who again plays a huge role in the entire story, is first described as bright and bubbly and sort of distracted. But as the main lead continues to encounter her sister, she continues to describe her. And every time she leads with the brightness, the cheerfulness, but she adds a new twist to it. There's another layer to this character. And so we start to understand that something is bothering her sister. And we make this discovery at the same time that she does. But this is so effective because it shows that our main character is paying attention to the world around her. And that makes us pay attention to the world around her. And so as we get a fuller picture of all of the supporting characters, the entire space comes to life. I don't just feel like I know the main character. I feel like I know the entire community that the story is based around. There was a lot of stuff in this book that I think I can use to improve my craft. And it was delightful reading this story as an author, as opposed to a reader, and understanding sort of the mechanics of how it goes together. Like I said, I literally have pages of notes that I took, and there were some particularly effective sort of scenes and pacing details that I wrote down that I'm going to try to implement in my own writing. But one of the biggest things that I'm taking away is the level of character description. Because I tend, in my stories, not to describe very much at all. You get your brief initial description of the character, and then I sort of rely on the social and physical cues of dialogue and action in order to reveal more about them. But I really like this method of giving a deeper description each and every time. And so I think that's going to be my biggest takeaway, is understanding that process of drawing your reader into the world through redescribing the same things over and over again with new, fresh perspective. Now, like I said earlier, I don't really read a lot of rom-coms, and reading this book brought up a number of questions. There were a couple of things that happened that I sort of wonder, are these tropes for this genre? Is this something specific to this book? And I need to get to the bottom of it. For example, the way it ended was surprising to me. It sort of tapered off in a way that I didn't anticipate and didn't have quite as abrupt of an ending. And I'm not sure if that's because she was going for a more cozy feel, or if there were just some things she had set up earlier in the book that needed to be resolved, and it was hard to resolve them in that sort of abrupt manner, or what. But because I want to get to the bottom of this, I now have to read some more books. So if you have any recommendations in the romantic comedy genre, I'd love to know. Also, if you just have any books in general that you would like to get an author's take on, put those down in the comments as well.